Okay, so today we are going to continue some of the conversations that we've been having over our last few meetings on the non-per capita program, kind of continuing to work through the discussions, bringing back some of the feedback that we've received on that program and the different pieces of the updates that we've been talking about so far. So we're excited to share all of that with you. We also have a guest presenter with us today, and we're very excited to have Erin Regland with us to talk a little bit more about integrating water and land use and kind of our proposed planning category that we're adding to our BMP list for the 5 MPs. So thank you, Erin, for being here today. And then after Erin presents, we'll also have kind of an introductory discussion of the GPCD program, provide a little background, and introduce some ideas for how we move forward with that program, looking for additional ideas and input from all of you. So we have a very full agenda today, so we will go ahead and dive right in. If we could go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, we have been spending the last several meetings talking through the non-per capita conservation program, including how we might update the provider tiers, how we might update the BMP points, how we might update BMP categories, whether there's additional categories that we should add. McKenna's going to talk about all of that in a lot more detail later in this meeting. But I just wanted to highlight that we have made a lot of progress through the discussions and proposals that we've heard from stakeholders and from our own work throughout these meetings. So we really appreciate the participation of all of you throughout that process. I think this will be a much better end product because of that engagement and involvement. So thank you for that. We did just very briefly mention the GPCD program in the last meeting. We'll provide some additional detail there today. We're going to have to spend at least another meeting on that GPCD, I think. We're going to introduce it today, start to get some initial feedback and ideas on that today, but we'll also need to dive into that in a little bit more detail in future meetings. So just a quick notice that our next meeting is on November 4th. And two quick last things before I hand it off to McKenna. Please do make sure if you have any questions or comments, put those in the chat box, unmute yourself, feel free to ask any questions. We do have that Google Forms questionnaire to help you all provide additional feedback after the meeting if that's your preference. So with that, I think the next slide is McKenna, so I'll go ahead and hand it off to her.
Thank you, Natalie. Okay. So I know we covered a lot of material related to the non-per capita conservation program in our last municipal subgroup meeting, and I want to thank everyone who provided feedback on the options that were presented. We really appreciate all the stakeholder participation in these meetings and the input we received from our questionnaires. In response to the stakeholder input we received, we started drafting some proposals for the 5th Management Plan's non-per capita conservation program. I will be going over the responses we received and the proposals we've started to draft. These proposals are not finalized, and we are still requesting your input and feedback as we continue drafting them. I will be pausing throughout the presentation for comments on the drafted proposals. One idea that was proposed in the last municipal subgroup meeting was BMP implementation requirements that would vary by tier. If you missed the last meeting, I included the example that was presented on this slide. We did not receive a lot of support on this item because of the additional complexity it would add to the program. So we are not planning on moving forward with this proposal. However, if anyone has any additional thoughts on this item, we would be happy to hear your comments. I went through this table in our last meeting and discussed some of the options we have for the fifth management plans, which are listed in the column on the right. I will be using this table as a guide to go through the input we've received regarding these options. First, we have the tier structure, which includes the number of tiers and the number of service connections per tier. In our last meeting, AMWA and ADWR presented various tier proposals for the fifth management plans. We asked which proposal you preferred, and 80% of responses preferred proposal 3A, which has a normal distribution. The proposals that were presented are shown on this slide, and proposal 3A is the graph that is highlighted with the gold-colored outline. Based on the input we've received, we suggest moving forward with proposal 3A for the development of the fifth management plan's non-per capita program. I will pause here for a minute to see if there are any additional questions or comments regarding this proposal.
Thanks, McKenna. I'm not seeing any questions or comments.
Okay, sounds good. I'll just pause for a few seconds longer so that if anyone's typing out any questions or comments, we have given you some time to put those in the chat. Maggie, did anything come through?
Nothing at this time.
Okay, feel free as we go forward in this presentation, if anyone needs to come back to any of these items, we can return to them. So our next option for discussion is whether all BMPs should be weighted equally or whether some BMPs should be worth multiple points. In our last meeting, we asked the group if they were in favor of all BMPs being treated as equal or continuing with certain BMPs being worth multiple points. Responses were split on this item, and ADWR is proposing that we retain the structure of BMPs being weighted differently. We feel that this incentivizes providers to implement BMPs that may take more effort, but also yield greater water savings. Since BMP points were just implemented in the fourth management plans, we don't have information yet on whether or not this type of point structure is effective. So we propose keeping the points in the fifth management plans and then reassessing their effectiveness in the sixth management plans or whatever other form of groundwater management comes after the fifth management plans. So I will pause here to open this up for discussion and see if anyone has any comments on this.
Thanks, McKenna. No questions or comments yet.
Okay, thank you, Maggie. Next, we have BMP point requirements per tier. So this BMP points proposal was developed based on the tiers in proposal 3A. The green section on the left side of the first table lists the fourth management plan service connections, tiers, and required number of BMP points per tier. The blue section on the right lists the proposed fifth management plan service connections, tiers, and proposed number of points required per tier. We suggest that the number of required BMP points for Tier 1 providers remain the same at 3 points. Tier 2 be required to earn 5 points. Tier 3 increase from 8 to 10 points. And Tier 4 increase from 15 to 20 points. We increased the point values for a number of BMPs in the draft fifth management plan BMP list, and we hope that more BMPs are added to this list through the development of the proposed new planning category. This would provide even more opportunities to earn BMP points. And the table below is just a reference that shows the total number of BMP points available in the 4th management plan and the number of BMP points available in the current version of the draft Appendix 5C. And I will pause here for questions.
Thanks, McKenna. I'm not seeing any feedback or questions coming through yet.
Okay, and also just a reminder, all of these items, you can provide more in-depth feedback through our questionnaire on any of these proposals.
Thanks, McKenna. I do have a question here from Patrick Adams. He's commented, does ADWR have a standard method or criteria for assigning points to different BMPs so that they are weighted consistently?
I don't believe we have a standard. We've used a historical, the management plan's historical structure and built on that to increase the number of BMP points with each management plan. So here we kept the tier 1 at 3 points just because we reduced the service connections from 0 to 5,000 to 0 to 1,000. So those are pretty small providers, and we think 3 BMP points is still efficient for those. But we would be open to hearing any type of standard if anyone has information on that or any suggestions on how we could better assign these BMP point requirements.
McKenna, this is Natalie. If I could just add to that a little bit, kind of in addition to what McKenna talked about with the tiers, for the individual BMPs, the points values are kind of range at this point from 1 to 3 points, and the weighting for each one is really, we want to weight more highly those that have more conservation potential or require a significant amount of resources to implement. So it's not really a mathematical thing so much as something where we're kind of trying to incentivize those individual BMPs that we know are more difficult or effective, for that matter.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks, McKenna and Natalie. I believe you covered this and understood Patrick's question quite clearly. He was clarifying, however, in the next comment that he was referring to point values for each BMP, not the target.
Okay, thanks, Natalie, for jumping in and covering that.
I have another question here from Terry Sue Rossi. She has commented, is this only applicable to those water providers subject to the non-per capita program, right? Meaning not any small water provider.
Correct. Right.
Yes, sorry, sorry, Kenna. Yes, that's correct. Both the non-per capita program and the GPCD program are for large providers only. The small water provider program is a separate thing.
Thank you both. No additional questions right now.
Thank you. So the last component of the non-per capita conservation program is category requirements. We asked whether points should be earned from a minimum number of categories, whether we should assign minimum and maximum point requirements per category, if we should do something else besides these two options, or if we should continue with no category requirements. These are the responses we received. The majority of the responses were in favor of requiring points be earned from a minimum number of categories, which would be determined by the provider's tier. Based on these responses, we are proposing points be earned from a minimum number of categories. On the left side of this table, it lists the fourth management plan service connections tiers and the 2018 average number of categories that BMP points were earned from. And on the right, it lists the proposed fifth management plan service connections tiers and proposed number of categories BMP points must be earned from. We are hoping that this requirement will diversify the type of BMPs providers are implementing, and the larger the provider, the more diverse their BMP selection. Since this would be a brand new requirement, we use the average number of categories BMPs were earned from to set the bar. Just like all the other proposals, we're open to suggestions, and I will stop here for questions and comments.
Thank you, McKenna. I have a question here from John Munderlow. He's commented, the jump from tier 2 to tier 3 and tier 3 to tier 4 doubles BMP points. This is an abrupt change for adding one service connection. Will ADWR work with water providers to provide a softer landing?
Hi, John. This is Natalie Mast. So we believe that there are a wide enough range for each of those BMP options that it should be reasonable for the various providers of those sizes to achieve that number of points. We see that it doubles, yes, but also 5 additional points is between tier 2 and 3 is really not that many. 10 additional points for the larger providers is something that is manageable. If there is a transition period needed for a given provider, we could certainly have a conversation with that individual provider at that time. But we don't currently have a specific structure in place for that. But perhaps that's something we can kind of consider here, having some kind of a transition year or something like that for those providers moving tiers.
Thank you, Natalie. Question from Jennifer. If this is for large providers only, why is one category 1 to 1,000 service connections?
So the definition of large provider is actually provided in statute. Any municipal provider that serves more than, I'm quoting this number off the top of my head, I believe it's 500 acre-feet of water, is defined under the statute as a large municipal provider. So someone having 1,000 service connections could certainly be a large municipal provider, particularly if they are serving more than just residential customers.
Thank you, Natalie. Jennifer commented, got it, thanks. And Terry Sue Rossi has commented that it's 250 acre-feet.
Thank you, Terry Sue, for clarifying that for me. I couldn't remember if it was 250 or 500 off the top of my head. I appreciate that. So 250 acre-feet for large providers, excuse me. Thanks.
Nothing additional, thanks.
Thank you. So in our last meeting, we proposed the addition of a planning category because we were receiving input from stakeholders that they would like to see BMPs related to integrated water and land use. We asked people whether they would like to see the addition of this category, and as you can see on the slide, the majority of responses were in favor of this new category. However, we did receive a lot of questions about this new category, so I'm excited to introduce Erin Rugland, who will be presenting on the benefits and BMP potential of integrated water and land use. Erin Rugland is a research fellow at the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy. She is the author of a manual about incorporating water into comprehensive planning and she co-authored similar guidance on integrated land use and water efficiency plans in the state of Colorado. She has dual BS degrees in public policy and justice studies from ASU. And thank you, Erin, for being here. I'll go ahead and hand it off to you now.
Thanks, McKenna. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. So I will provide kind of an overview presentation of not only the planning BMP category that we've brainstormed with ADWR, but some background information about integrated water and land use, just so everyone is working from the same information as far as what the benefits of such a program might be. Next slide. So as McKenna mentioned, I'm a research fellow with the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy, and I just wanted to give a brief overview of who we are in our work and why we are involved in brainstorming this planning BMP with ADWR. So we are based in Arizona and work throughout the 7 Colorado River Basin states with the mission to help communities integrate land and water planning. So to this end, we do research, technology innovation, develop partnerships, and then do education and training on this topic. And we really believe this is the next frontier of water conservation. And one highlight I might provide that's relevant to my presentation today is that we work closely with the Sonoran Institute to put on what's called a Growing Water Smart training. And as part of this training, we educated and trained 7 Arizona communities on integrated water and land use planning earlier this year. So in addition to those survey respondents, we know that at least 7 Arizona communities are actively working towards integrated water and land use planning and are excited for potential future opportunities as well. Next slide. So some of the background about integrated water and land use is that the most important distinction, I think, is that there's a historical disconnect between water and land use. Both at the regulation side and in terms of how they're managed and bought and sold. So water is typically regulated at the state and federal level, while land is regulated by local government. So this can cause some tensions and disconnect in the management of both resources. And then even at the local level, as I'm sure all of you can attest to very well, these are often siloed departments without a lot of interface between water and land use planners, unless there is like specific interest within a community to have these 2 resources that are integrated and managed jointly. So the American Planning Association has done survey research on this and has found that an overwhelming majority of planners in particular indicated that they have not been involved enough in water planning and decisions to the detriment of planning for their communities in general. And then water and land use are also separated at many levels. So they are separate commodities and property rights. They're bought and sold differently. And again, as a lot of Arizona communities are very familiar with, the impacts of local development may not impact that community's water source directly. So if your water is piped from elsewhere, you may not have to worry about the immediate implications of development, but how development is done does impact your water use regardless of where your water comes from. Next slide. So the crux of the issue is that land use decisions are made every day that shape our water future, and development influences water demand, so we need to plan for development with water constraints in mind. So the coordination of land and water use decisions is critical if we are to meet the current and future needs of our people, economy, and environment. Next slide. Throughout research that I've done at the Babbitt Center, we have interviewed various water providers about this topic and found 4 main takeaways about why integrated water and land use planning is beneficial. So the first is that land use planning and development approval influence water use initially. So the type of building you decide to create influences the ultimate water demand. We know, for instance, that restaurants use more water than a retail site. And so that can influence the kind of commercial development and water use that results. Similar for single family homes versus multifamily homes, there's different water demands associated with these different land use types. The second is that long-range planning and development approval processes are 2 important points of collaboration between land use planners and water managers. So these are processes such as the general plan or water utility planning processes, and then the development approval processes where you're working with a developer to hash out final details of any land use. So meaningful input from water providers at these stages can make all the difference in making water smart decisions. If the water provider is in the room during your general planning process, they can make comments such as, here are our current conditions and the expected water demand we expect to see over time. If you change land use in this way, this is how it will impact our water supply and demand budget. And then similar conversations can be had about infrastructure and more capacity related things as well. The third takeaway is that all providers can collaborate with land use authorities. So I think often it's a perception that small providers might have a harder time with collaboration, but this isn't always the case. Sometimes it's easier because there's less barriers to entry in a small community. People may know each other better and be able to formulate those relationships more quickly. So size or capacity are not automatically inhibiting factors to collaboration, though of course everyone's community will be a little bit different in terms of the barriers they face. And then the final takeaway from our interviews and research has been the value of technical assistance and tools. So in essence, the more resources providers have to work with, the better and more flexible they can be in trying to make these various connections with land use planning. Next slide. So I'll provide some background in the lead up to the planning category if you want to advance it. Okay. So McKenna just showed us that it has been requested by the fifth management plan stakeholders, and this request has been affirmed in the follow-up survey. Next. However, we've seen a desire to have the planning category better defined, so I've identified two things that I'm going to clarify before I jump into the draft BMPs. So the first question has been basically like, what is the realm of land use that this category may cover? Is it making plans, implementing them, zoning requirements, or building permits? Next. So in essence, the proposed category that we've drafted so far has a range of actions for all aspects of land use planning, development, and building. So this will be clarified as I walk through the BMPs, but basically it covers all steps of land use planning processes. The next question has been about the associated water savings of integrated planning. Can you make a direct link? And unfortunately, this is not definitively studied in all cases, so it really depends on the land use connection that you're trying to make. Like you can tell in your building type that a multifamily home may use less water per capita than a single family home. That is something you could study and prove, but the correlated water savings of incorporating water into the general plan, for instance, may not have a tangible water savings associated with it unless that's a very specific goal of the general plan. So it varies by BMP, but the other point I'd make, if you want to click the next bullet, is that another perspective is to consider the save time, costs, and efficiencies of using integrated planning to make water efficient development from the outset. So if you're building water smart from the start, as we like to say, you then don't have to do as much to target the end user to implement water conservation methods. So their home, for instance, might already have water conserving fixtures or xeric landscape, and then you don't have to target a homeowner to try and implement those things themselves, which comes with added time and rebate costs and such. Next slide. So here is the proposed framework of the planning category so far. We have 8 BMPs in total, and so these are the first 3. The first is land use planning and water utility coordination and communication. So this was originally a BMP called industry and/or regional partnerships in the last management plan. And we would like to tweak this a little bit to basically just talk about the land use authority and water provider meeting regularly and documenting these meetings in the CER annual reports. Collaboration between land use authorities and water providers is really crucial for getting any of these things off the ground. So we think this coordination and communication piece is key to the rest of the BMPs. The next BMP is staff education or training, which is a new addition. So this would be that staff from either the water provider or their associated land use authority could attend an educational program related to integrate water and land use planning or management and get a BMP point for this education, so as it will help them integrate and advance these techniques in their own community. The next is the non-residential water use plan, which is an existing BMP under the name non-residential water use plan requirement. And so in this draft, we've kept it the same as the original with a simple bullet addition about considering land use planning interventions within these water use plans. So things like landscaping requirements and things like that. Next slide. The next BMP is this integrated long-range planning piece, which is a new addition. So this includes a menu of options of which we've proposed water should be included in at least 3 of these types of plans. So it's the general plan, the capital improvement plan, sustainability, resilience, or climate plans, hazard mitigation plans, or one water or integrated water management plans. And then, as many of you may know, there is an existing requirement for communities of a certain size in Arizona to include a water element in their general plan. So the general plan piece would have additional stipulations that a provider should be involved in the general planning process as outlined by statute, and then otherwise collaborate in the general plan by mechanisms such as calculating the water use by land use type, in zoning maps and proposed zoning changes, creating policies for water efficient land use forms, creating zones for water such as recharge zones or overlay zones, or policies for water efficient development in the comprehensive plan. The next one is conservation-oriented development, and this is a new addition that really speaks to the efficiency of buildings specifically. So this is a menu of options related to implementing or incentivizing water efficient buildings. So a provider could get points for following LEED certifications, EPA WaterSense certifications, water efficient model homes, using low impact development or green infrastructure for stormwater management in different buildings, creating developer incentives, creating water budgets by land use type, or by doing irrigation or landscaping requirements. Next slide. So the final 3 are water demand adaptive management and shortage responses. This would be a new addition that really gets to drought mitigation planning and other programs for making it easier to reduce water demand if needed in the face of more extreme drought or shortage. So just building in those fail-safes so there's a plan if needed. And then the next is water supply diversity, and this would be a BMP to provide points for providers who are trying to diversify or otherwise make their water supply portfolios more robust, such as through recharge and recovery efforts, groundwater modeling to better manage their groundwater, or through regional collaboration to bolster and strengthen the health of their watersheds. And then the final land use BMP that we have here is the formalization of water efficiency requirements. So this is a new addition, but pulls from existing BMPs, in particular, the ordinances category of BMPs. And so this includes different options, such as including water efficient ordinances, codes, or regulations, removing conflicting regulations that may exist. So my favorite example for this one is if you have residential turf restrictions, but a turf requirement in stormwater basins, that may send a mixed message to your service area and customers. So removing conflicts like that. And then the final one would be to add water efficiency into the development planning and approval processes. So this gets back to that collaboration piece where you, as the water provider, would be invited to the table of these land use decisions for input and increased efficiencies. Next slide. So I will take Q&A in a second, and first wanted to just describe the next steps here. So we will continue discussions with stakeholders about this proposed planning category in BMP through this meeting and future municipal subgroup meetings. The questionnaire, and in particular, the questionnaire that McKenna highlighted at the beginning of this presentation, and then, of course, as always, written and or emailed comments to ADWR. And then your input will be used to continue drafting and refining this proposed category and associated BMPs. Next slide. So do we have any questions?
Erin. I do see a question here from Heather. She's commented, can you give an example of what type of questions you might recommend adding into the non-residential water use plan for the proposed modification to include consideration of land use planning in these plans?
Yeah, I think the language we've drafted so far is pretty general. So it is consideration of land use planning best management practices to promote demand management, water efficiency, and water conservation. And I think this goes to things such as lot size and landscaping. So landscaping would probably be the most tangible one for existing ones. And then if the target audience for that water use plan was considering a building expansion or something, I think some of the other land use tools could come into play.
Thank you, Erin. Nothing additional at this time.
All right. Well, if Erin, will you be around for the rest of the meeting if people do have questions for you that come up later?
Yeah, certainly. So the next slide too has my contact information if anyone is interested in connecting with the Babbitt Center or me on these issues generally. And otherwise, I look forward to any additional comments or questions that may come up here.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin, for presenting today. So next up, we will begin our discussion on the gallons per capita per day, or GPCD program. Caitlin Parker will be presenting on the GPCD program, and Caitlin is the municipal planner for the AMA section at AGWR. And Caitlin, if you're ready, you can go ahead and take over from here.
Okay, thanks, McKenna. Good morning, everyone. Like McKenna said, my name is Caitlin, and I'm going to be talking to you guys today about the gallons per capita per day conservation program, or simply called GPCD program. As most of you are aware, the Groundwater Management Act states that the director shall develop management plans for each AMA and for each management period. These management plans contain mandatory conservation programs that are to be designed to achieve reductions in groundwater withdrawals. And today we will be discussing the total GPCD program, which is one of these conservation programs written in Chapter 5 of the management plan. Next slide. All right, some quick general notes on the GPCD program. It is limited to municipal providers who have a designation of assured water supply, or we commonly refer to this as a DAWS. This program is designed to reduce per capita use over time by assigning a GPCD target to each provider. The target, or sometimes called requirement, is calculated by the department using a formula that is based on the conservation potential for each provider service area. While the GPCD program has remained relatively static over time, there have been some changes to the GPCD target formula from the 3rd to the 4th management plan. But overall, the statutory language is pretty vague, and as you can see, it simply states to have a reasonable reductions in per capita use and additional conservation requirements for non-irrigation uses. So really, this leaves some flexibility for the development of the 5th management plan conservation program. Next slide. So how is GPCD compliance determined? Well, we compare the GPCD requirement to the actual GPCD the provider produced that year. The actual GPCD is calculated using variables such as the available water supply and service area population. However, the management plan states that some water sources be excluded from the available water supply, such as some effluent and sometimes spill. And I say sometimes spill because this water type is excluded in the GPCD calculation for the 3rd management plan, but it is included in the 4th management plan. Within this program is a flexibility provision. When we compare the GPCD requirement and the actual GPCD, the difference of the two will either result in a positive or a negative GPCD. This positive or negative GPCD will either be credited or debited to a flexibility account. And this flexibility account is maintained by the department on an annual basis. There is a maximum credit and a maximum debit amount that can be accrued in this account, and the balance of this account will determine a provider's compliance status with the GPCD program. And an annual notice goes out to each provider in the GPCD program, and it will contain the GPCD requirement, the actual GPCD, and the flex account balance. And these typically go out in November of each year. Next slide. So just next, I'm going to quickly go over the total GPCD requirement calculation for the forest management plan. Next slide. The forest management plan GPCD requirement will be determined by comparing 3 different GPCDs. So it will be the default, the minimum, and the maximum. And here on the slide, you can see each of these 3 GPCDs and how they are calculated. So a provider will have 3 GPCDs calculated and compared before a GPCD requirement is assigned to their service area. And that GPCD requirement will either be the default, the minimum, or the maximum. So following the logic on the slide, the GPCD requirement will be the default GPCD unless the default GPCD is less than the minimum. Then the requirement will be the minimum GPCD. If the default is greater than the maximum GPCD, then the requirement will be the maximum GPCD. And then you can see Appendix 5A for more details on the calculations for each of those 3 GPCDs. Next slide. So at the next subgroup, we plan to discuss potential updates to the non-residential component rates used in calculating the GPCD requirement for the forest management plan. But we are looking for more to discuss, and I know that the GPCD program can be a little complex with all the different calculations going on. So at the next group, we're just looking for more topics we could talk about for the 5th management plan, how we will establish a target, if we're going to have minimums and maximums, or really if there are any other components or considerations that you guys think we should consider. So I'll have you guys just give suggestions now, or if you can't think of any right now, we can always submit them through the questionnaire. But I'll just take a few moments to see if you guys have any suggestions now. You want to talk about anything for next time?
Thank you, Caitlin. I'm not seeing any questions or comments yet.
Okay, maybe give it a minute more. I know the non-residential component rates were some things that people were confused on, so maybe we can talk about that. And then, I don't know, anything else? Any service area population comments? Nope. All right, I guess we will just move on to the next slide. So this is just a brief, very brief rundown of the GPCD program, and it was just to get you guys thinking about this for next time. Like I said, next meeting we will discuss some more details, the gory details of how those calculations were calculated. But for now, if you guys have any questions just on the GPCD program, I can take those now.
Thanks, Caitlin. Just to add to what Caitlin said, we are really looking for suggestions and ideas from all of you. So obviously that does not have to come in this meeting today, but between now and the next meeting, either through the questionnaire or with your own folks, please be thinking about ways we can go about this. We'd love to hear from you, work with you on ideas for how we can update those GPCD targets for the 5th management plans. So, thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, Natalie. I have a question here from Sandra House. She's commented, is there any consideration of looking at specific types of non-residential?
I think at this point we're a little bit limited to what we have on the current annual reports. So we are certainly going to look at the different, we're working on doing some analysis of those different types of non-residential based on that information on the annual reports. But we also recognize that there are some inconsistencies with the way that data is reported. So that's part of why we would like to get some feedback from all of you to see if that's worth looking at. If there are specific types of non-residential that should be split out, or specific types that maybe could be combined in different ways. We're certainly interested in hearing all of that from you guys. So yeah, any suggestions you might, specific suggestions that you might have with regard to that would certainly be very helpful.
Thank you, Natalie. Sandra has commented that having more specific categories for non-residentials would be helpful. Brent Billingsley had some feedback for Aaron. He's commented, "Nice job, Aaron." And a question here from Joanna Toms. Does ADWR have any plans to offer a GPCD 101 presentation on your methodology used to calculate GPCD for the 5 MP?
Thanks, Joanne, for that question. It's a good question. So we don't have any specific plans for that sort of thing at this point. Although I guess that's going to be part of these meetings as we decide what that methodology will be. We'll be talking through it. We do always include details on that methodology in the management plans themselves. And as we get closer to those management plans being implemented, we would certainly be open to providing that type of education on that methodology.
Thank you, Natalie. Nothing additional in the chat box. Sorry, Heather has commented regarding Joanne's comment. That sounds like a great idea, and I would second a request for that.
Great, thank you, Heather.
I'm not seeing any additional questions or comments coming through.
Thank you, Maggie. If there are no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and start on the closing remarks. If you go to the next slide, please, McKenna. So thank you again today for your comments on the discussion, and thank you to our guest, Aaron, for your presentation today. Again, we are looking for your comments and feedbacks on the ADWR proposal for the revisions to the non-per capita program, and on the information that Aaron presented today about a potential option for the need planning category. This can be done here today, as you have been doing through the chat box, or if you'd like to take the time to digest this information or elaborate on your comments, you can also do this through our questionnaire or through our management plans email. And thank you, Caitlin, for introducing the GPCD program. We, again, are looking for feedback and comments on potential updates to the GPCD program. And again, this can be done through the questionnaire and our management plans email. We did want to introduce the topic today at this meeting, and then with your feedback, we'll continue that discussion on our next subgroup meeting on November the 4th. Next slide, please. As a reminder, we do have some other subgroups coming up, and they are listed here on this slide with a full workgroup meeting planned in December. And the link with all the meeting information and all the recordings and presentation slides is also available here at the top of this slide. And the next slide, please. So thank you again for your time and engagement today and throughout this whole process. Your feedback and your discussion is greatly appreciated and invaluable to us. The management plans email and Natalie's email is listed here on this slide. And then I'm going to go ahead and link that questionnaire again in the chat box, and you can provide your feedback and comments there as well. And I will go ahead and pause here in case there are any other questions.
Thank you, Amanda. Question here from Dina Burns. She's commented, is the plan to consider residential separate from non-residential GPCD, or to keep them together as in the 4th management plan?
So I think the intent would be to combine them, similar to what we've done in the fourth management plan. What we've heard from people related to the fourth management plan is that there was some difficulty with the GPCD targets because those non-residential components were not updated after the third management plans. So the third management plan non-residential components were just carried forward into the fourth. So that's something we want to reassess here is whether we need to update that non-residential component, but I anticipate that it will be that the final target will be a combined GPCD target.
Dina has commented, thank you. I'm not seeing anything additional in the chat box at this time.
All right, if there are no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and close the meeting for today. Thank you again for your participation, and please stay safe, everyone.